From Nina Simone to Bowie, the Velvet Underground to the Rolling Stones, taking in Cairo and Beijing along the way, this wide-ranging conversation with the PolyU's former director of the English Language Centre, Dr. Bruce Morrison, looks back on his career and his reflections on students and learning. Podcast hosts Dawn Gillis and Eric Tindall ask the questions, sometimes, and get a musical education thrown in for good measure.
All right, welcome back everybody to the Teacher's Lift. A very happy year of the Tiger to all of you out there. I'm Eric Tindall, and here I'm with my lovely partner, Dawn Gillis.
Hello, partner in crime.
We are coming at you today from the Hong Kong Polytechnic University. And Dawn, Happy New Year to you too.
Yeah, same. It's Year of the Tiger now. I'm not sure if it's off to a good start, but let's hope things improve.
It's off to a start. That's all we can say. Did you have a good break? Have a good holiday?
Yeah, it was a good break. Just relaxing at home because there's not much else to do. But now we're back to the grind.
Yes, but back to the grind, and we'll keep things optimistic today. I kind of look at the bright side, I guess. We'll leave the depressing topics for other episodes.
That's a good idea.
So today we have a very special guest. He is the longtime director of the PolyU English Language Centre and an important name in the fields of language learning and self-access learning and English medium instruction. Our ex-boss and a very good friend, Dr. Bruce Morrison.
Hi, Eric. Hi, Dawn.
Hi, Bruce.
And I just want to say hello to Aditi, who was a colleague with us, who I happened to meet when I was walking the day before yesterday. So hi, Aditi, if you're watching this.
She may very well be watching, or listening in.
Hopefully listening.
She's been a host a few times.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
The lift. Bruce, thank you for taking the time during this this stressful period for all of us in Hong Kong. Thank you for being here with us today, and welcome.
You're welcome.
Now, I guess we're gonna talk to you about your views on language learning and learning spaces. But before you do that, why don't you tell us how you got started in teaching?
Well, it was a bit serendipity, really. I was at university doing the normal things one does at university, and I was going home one day, rather the worse for drink, late at night. And there was this piece of paper pinned up on a tree that simply said, "Do you want to work in Egypt?" I thought, yeah, that sounds good. And so a couple of months later, I was at International House in London doing their 4-week teacher training course. And within 2 months, I was off to Cairo to start my first teaching job. So it's not what I'd intended at all. I hadn't intended to be a teacher. I didn't really know what I wanted to do, but Egypt sounded good.
Yeah. And how long did you spend there?
Egypt, just 2 years. Most of my career until I came to Hong Kong, I did 2 or 3, sometimes 4-year sort of stints, but Egypt was 2 years.
Okay. And it was Cairo you were in, you just said, right?
Yeah.
Wasn't it hot?
It was extraordinary when I first got there. The plane landed and the doors opened, and it was like the cliche of the pressure cooker.
Right.
I remember my first night lying in bed just thinking, no, I can't do this. I just can't. There's no aircon.
Yeah. I've been to Cairo myself, and I remember it was 55 degrees when I was there, and I wondered, wow, how do people live here? Yeah, so it made me appreciate our air conditioners that we have everywhere here in Hong Kong. So Bruce, yeah, you've mentioned that you've taught in Egypt as well as here in Hong Kong. So and obviously you've been in Hong Kong for much longer than Egypt. But out of all the places you have taught within your amazing lifespan, which one was the most memorable?
I appreciate it.
Which one was the most memorable?
Well, I was thinking about this when I was thinking about the question, and there really have to be two. And the first would be Egypt, and the second would be China. Egypt, as I said, was the first job I ever did. The place was amazing. This was back in '78, and it was an extraordinary experience. It was it was walking into another world. And in that way, it was extraordinary. The center, there were 20 new teachers, and it was an extraordinarily decadent time. We had a very, very, shall we say, a very good time, one way and another. But also it's where I learned to teach, because although you do a teaching course, before, you don't really know what you're doing, obviously, until you get into class. And what was the most challenging but the most fun part was that quite a few of the classes were absolute beginners. In other words, people who didn't even know how to say hello or how are you. They were complete beginners.
Wow.
And so since we taught using the direct method, there was no Arabic. It was all, basically just modeling and repeating, making sure meaning was clear. To my way of thinking, it was an extremely good introduction to teaching and to pedagogical grounding. So in that way, also, it was amazing. And the students were wonderful. We had a huge range of students, but as I say, the absolute beginners. And so Egypt was absolutely foundational for me, and everything really built on that. But some years later, in '86, from '86 to late '88, I was in Beijing. And that was extraordinary for other reasons. Obviously, like China, it was another world. China and Beijing, particularly in the late '70s, there were no private cars. There was very little public transport. You went everywhere by bicycle. There were very few foreigners. And so people were genuinely very friendly. It was an extraordinary environment. I lived in a hotel, a very large hotel, the Friendship Hotel, which was basically for foreign experts. And I worked at Tsinghua University, which is possibly the best university in China. And what was special about it in terms of the teaching was that I just finished my MA in applied linguistics. And as many of you will know, you do an MA and you don't really understand what it is you've just learned, psycholinguistics, statistics. But the thing was, I had to go to Tsinghua and I had to develop and teach an MA in applied linguistics program.
Wow.
For teachers, university teachers from all over China. And it was amazing because, as you know, you don't really know anything until you explain it to somebody else, until you teach it. Those of you who are married, who have partners who are non-native speakers, I think you probably know, your partner says, well, what does this mean? And you know the word, you've used it so many times throughout your life. And then you go, well, it's, and you can't explain it.
That's right.
You say, well, I know what it is, but I don't know how to explain it. And so for me, the applied linguistics course in China was that I finally understood what it was that I'd been learning for the past year. And then also working with teachers, many of them with long experience, many of whom had been Russian teachers, who'd then been repurposed is perhaps the wrong word, but whatever the word is. I think purposed is just about right. And so that was extraordinary. So to answer your question, I think Cairo and Beijing, for different reasons, but they really stand out for me.
And how long were you in Beijing for?
I've been there twice. In all 4 years, the first time 2 years, and then again back in '92, I was in Beijing again, but that time working for the British Council and setting up a self-access centre in Beijing. So 2 years and 2 years.
This was in the late 80s and the early 90s, a very different China.
Very different China. It was quite interesting going back in 92, because although it was only a short period, reasonably short period between the two, the change was dramatic. It was really beginning. So again, it was a different China, but again, hugely different from today. But yes, you're right.
How about the students, their attitudes towards learning English back at that time? Because English had been the imperialist language for.
Yeah. Well, as I say, the thing was they were teachers and they were English teachers. So in a way, they were atypical. So generally, there was a huge hunger for learning English. In every city, you used to have these English corners on a Sunday morning, and any foreigner who was silly enough to go into a park on Sunday morning would be surrounded by upwards of 100 people who just wanted to hear, often not even to talk, but to experience English. So there was a huge hunger for it, and also I think instrumentally people realized that this was not a way out, but a way forward, or a way to expand their horizons. So I think it was seen very positively.
Wow. So so it sounds like you had such an eye-opening experience between Cairo and Beijing, and it would have definitely been a totally different world from the UK and even here in Hong Kong. So what made you decide to relocate from Beijing to Hong Kong?
Okay, I won't go into the details. I'll just give you 2 words. Politics and love.
Oh, romance.
I can't tell you much about politics, and I don't feel like telling you much about the love. But I'd been through Hong Kong very many times living in China, and it was a place where I thought, well, it's nice to visit, but God, you wouldn't want to live there. Now, 27 years later, well, that's life.
Yes.
So, here we all are.
Yeah. So then when you did come to Hong Kong for some obvious reasons, did you start working here at PolyU, or did you go to the British Council?
No, I had to leave China fairly quickly. And I was very lucky. I'd met Richard Farmer, who was a guy who started the English Language Study Centre, which was the precursor to SIL. And I got to Hong Kong and just got in touch with him. And he said, sure, I'll get you a job. He said, it's an instructor's post. I said, that's fine, anything so that I can start to make my way. So I started, that was the English department then. I started as an instructor in the English department. So that's where it started. And then a few years later, I think about 3 years later, the Hong Kong government invested many millions of dollars in establishing self-access centers. And because in China, I'd established the self-access center for the British Council, I started the Center for Independent Language Learning at PolyU. That's where it all started.
Yeah, and we just heard. Yeah, you may have heard our listeners. You may have heard him just mention SIL, and that's what the Center for Independent Language Learning is. That was one of your, of course, major impacts here at PolyU was starting up the SIL and getting it going. But that was over 25 years ago, and in that span, of course. The notion of learning spaces and independent language learning has changed a lot, hasn't it, over those last 25 years today? So, just from your perspective, experiencing these changes over the last couple decades, how has independent language learning or self-access spaces changed?
Well, it's funny. In a way, I'm very surprised they're still around. I remember doing a talk at Hasselt about, I can't remember how many years ago, at least 5 years ago, about the future of self-access centers. and we were basically talking about how they were going to go virtual and would be disappearing, etc., etc. However, most of them, not all of them, but most of them are still around. And in many ways, if you go into them, they don't look an awful lot different. Our sill, thanks to Anna, looks a lot more sort of funky and welcoming, but they're still here. The obvious change, I don't think any of the change is really surprising when we look back on it. The obvious change has been a move away from a center which facilitated access to materials, which is the the self-access part. Whereas previously students might go into a resources center, but they'd have to go up to the desk and book out a book, check out a book, or check out an audio tape. The idea of the self-access center was that they could self-access the materials. Obviously, that's no longer a necessary role. And obviously the impact and ubiquity of first computers, and then I think even much more importantly, the mobile phone has changed the environment entirely. As I say, however, the centers are still there. The computers are slowly being stripped out and used much less, but the centers are still there. And I think I'm going to move into the next question that you asked me, which was the future of self-access learning. I don't think there is any self-access learning. As I mentioned, I think that term has disappeared. Independent learning and independent learning centers, I think what you're going to see is what's happening certainly at PolyU slowly, and I think elsewhere, is their purposes will change almost diametrically. They were sort of focusing on the independent and to some extent the individual learner. So somebody would go in there and get on with their stuff, however they wanted to do it. It reminds me of one of our very first students in SIL. I was on duty there one evening, and this guy would come in and he'd pick up a dictionary and he'd sit there and he started. And he was going through each page, 10 pages a night. And I chatted with him and suggested that he might do, something rather more sexy, like vocabulary lists or, But he said no, and he got quite defensive about it. He said, no, this is how I learn. Oh. And in the months that I saw him there, he worked his way slowly through the Oxford Learner's Dictionary. Wow. For him, that was his way of doing it. Anyway, I think what's happening now, or what has been happening, is a switch. Firstly, it was towards collaborative independent learning, students working in groups, students coming with their friendship groups, working together. And the teacher support that used to be very, very in the background, very much almost incidental. Indeed, many hours in the self-access center, there might not be a teacher, but there might be a help desk where students would go if they wanted to ask questions. I think we're moving more towards these spaces being places where students can interact not only with each other, but also with teachers. I think we're going to see the boundaries between things like the writing assistance program that we have at PolyU, where students go for help with their writing with a teacher, workshops which are separate from SIL or were separate from SIL, coming into the center so that it becomes truly a learning space rather than an independent learning center. And so I think philosophically, there'll be a move away from the notion of independence towards a notion of collaborative learning, right? Something along those lines. And clearly, an online element, the virtual element, is bound to start to impact even more. And whether you're going to start to get virtual elements to it, I'm not sure. That's as far as sort of my thinking on it goes.
It's almost it's almost as if they're changing from a places of self-access to places of interaction, right? Exactly. You go, if you're a student, you'll go here for chances to interact, whether it's with your classmates, whether with or your teacher or somebody else, or maybe even with the materials. Especially given this time with the pandemic and the lack of face-to-face interaction that many students are getting or experiencing, do you think that there is going to be that these let's quote unquote interactive centers are going to survive over the next 5 years, 10 years, because they've lasted this long, and as you've correctly pointed out, they're still here, and even though they've outlived all their predictions.
Well, what was interesting, I went into PolyU and went down to the center a couple of weeks ago, and I was talking to the guys there, and they were saying that actually they've been busier in the last few months than they had been for years before. Still had got very quiet. Now, part of that might be because it has been refurbished, it looks more friendly and welcoming. But I suspect also it's because it's one of the spaces that was open that encouraged interaction. Now, obviously, because of restrictions, that amount of interaction, degree of interaction, has had to chop and change. But I was surprised, but pleasantly surprised. And when I thought about it, it made sense. It's a place where the library does have its interactive spaces, but it's not quite so far developed at PolyU as it is at, say, Hong Kong U or UST. And so SIL has the potential to be a real learning space, I think. So I think with the right sort of direction and support, yes. Of course, they're expensive places. So whether it has to be seen as useful also by the management of the university.
Right. So Bruce, we've talked about how these independent language centers have changed and survived and thrived, let's say, in a different concept. But how has language teaching in the universities changed since you first came here to PolyU?
Okay,
we're trying not to age you, by the way. We're trying not to age you here.
This I had to think about because in some ways my sort of knee-jerk reaction, well, it hasn't changed. The teaching's still the teaching. We're using computers, we're doing this, doing that, but the teaching itself hasn't changed. But I think actually it has changed. And there are two ways that it seems to me that might have had the greater impact. And one of those is related to the administration, and one is related to the learners. Obviously, the teaching itself goes through phases. We have task-based learning, you have this type of learning. The various methodologies change. But for me, perhaps the most critical impact has been since I joined PolyU in '94 to now, and particularly perhaps in the last 5 years, 10 years perhaps, is an increased centralization of control by the university. When I came to PolyU, it was very much the old type of UK institution where a teacher would have their class. There would be a curriculum, but it would be fairly loose. And basically, you would teach your stuff. You had your class, that was your class, and you go away and you deal with it. Which meant, of course, you had to prepare everything yourself. You had to do all the legwork, if you like. Whereas now, one can go in with course notes and just deliver stuff. So I think in that way there was much more dependence on the teacher, but also teacher autonomy. And the way that this centralization has been effected is by increasing quality assurance. And this isn't just PolyU, it isn't just in Hong Kong. I'm sure you're all aware, it's across the world. This obsession with QA, which gets in the way of everybody. The teachers, the course leaders, certainly center directors, all the way up to the presidents of the university. This obsession with ticking boxes, writing reports, making sure that this happens, having to questionnaire students about everything, finding out this and that. And as you all are very aware, it takes up an inordinate amount of time.
Yes.
Inordinate amount of time. And it's something that, in many ways, I think academics who take on an administrative or leadership role are probably not actually terribly well equipped to do. It borrows an awful lot from the business world, and sometimes the fit isn't very comfortable with the pedagogical world. So I think that's one aspect, and I think that's had a huge impact, as I say, right the way hierarchically from top to bottom and across, in terms of curriculum development, in terms of trying to make sure that, students are learning the same things. Assessments have to be standardized and checked. You all know the issue. The other one.
No, go ahead. Yeah.
The other one is broader, and certainly dates back to the 70s, to the notion of learner-centeredness, and that the classroom or the teaching should be learner rather than teacher-centered. And what's happened in Hong Kong, and I suspect it's happened elsewhere, but since I've been in Hong Kong, I recognize it here. You get the focus on the learner. And this is great, because instead of just doing what we want to do, we try to find out what it is the learner needs. We try to find out if the learner is understanding what they're learning. We scaffold the learner. We make ourselves available for the learner. We try and give formative feedback to the learner, etc., etc. And that seems generally to be a good thing. The perhaps negative side of that comes out, I think, sometimes I don't think it is just in Hong Kong, but as I say, it certainly is in Hong Kong, is it's rather like having a one-child system where the child gets spoiled and the child expects that they will have steak on Friday night. Why haven't I got steak? Why isn't it cooked properly? Why doesn't it come with peas? Why are the chips too thin? And I think we run the risk of giving the learners such expectations that we're beginning to not be able to meet those expectations. And it's not helped by things like student feedback questionnaires, which again set up expectations, which are all logical. I mean, it's very difficult to argue against asking a student whether they think their teacher has done a good job. I mean, it's logical. But I think the focus on the learner has the positive, but also the potential negative impacts. And so for me, what I've seen in the last 25 years, I think those two probably have the most impact. As I say, teaching methodologies come and go, materials, I think, have got better and better. But those two aspects, I think, have had a great impact.
And that's interesting that you mentioned the two changes that you mentioned. Number one, the obsession with quality assurance and box ticking and bureaucratic procedures, and number two, this focus on the student and almost the student becomes the customer. The one similarity I see between both of these, and you referred to that in your answer, was maybe this comes from the business world. And would you say that that's the main driver of both of these changes, that this obsession with quality assurance and this obsession with pleasing the customer? Is that has that happened because we have become more of a corporate a reflection of the corporate city in which we live? Or
I don't think it's just us. I mean, a perfect example globally is the British Council, which has been ravaged and, to my way of thinking, just doesn't resemble anything like the quality organization it used to be, because it's driven by corporate aims and corporate goals. I know people who are in the council, and a number who've left because they said, it's a business. It's not about the teaching. It's about a business. And interestingly, I work on the doctorate program for the Faculty of Humanities, and I do a session on learning beyond the curriculum. And I like to point out the amount of money that gets poured into the drive towards, I was going to say computer-assisted language learning, but they use computer-mediated education. And I can't off the top of the head of me remember the numbers, but they are staggering. So in other words, what's actually driving all this move towards computer-mediated education? Some is pedagogical, but an awful lot of it is from the corporate world, and a lot of it perhaps coming from the people who want to sell you the machines that we do these things on. So I would agree with you, Eric, completely. I think a corporatization, if that's such a word, of not just of our branch of education, but education in general. Indeed, not just education, but the health system and everything else. The whole world is driven much more by a corporate vision than I think it certainly was when I was younger.
Yeah, you have made a good point there that education has certainly become a major moneymaker, and even the international school system, I think it's the same way, right? They're focused on enrolling students to make money. We can argue that universities are doing something very similar. So yeah, it makes it quite difficult, I think, for us teachers to focus on our let's say our lessons and development and so on. So what do you think makes a good teacher? Because things have definitely changed over time, as you've mentioned, things from language centers to computers to technology. We're living in the digital era now. We're online. We have a lot of things being thrown at us, checking boxes and so on. So it is quite difficult, I think, to be a teacher nowadays. Sometimes I think that. So what makes a good one?
Okay, this got me thinking, and rather than just give you my ideas, I went back to a paper I wrote with Stephen Evans, who, as some of you might know, is an ex-colleague from the English department, and we were doing some long-term, large-scale research into the student experience of their first year and 2 years at university. And one of the focuses we had was on your teacher. What makes a good teacher?
Right.
So the first thing I did when I was thinking about this, I went back to the literature review I did for that, because, of course, that question has been around for many, many years, ever since I've been teaching. And there's a general sort of agreement in the literature that there are three aspects to it. First, subject knowledge. In other words, you know what you're talking about. Secondly, pedagogical skill. In other words, things like classroom management, lesson preparation, lesson timing, etc. And thirdly, effective skills, the things that engender respect from the students and help enable classroom learning. Now, for me, the first two, the subject knowledge and the pedagogical skills, provide confidence. The confidence for the teacher, but the confidence for the students that they're going to be able to learn, because this person knows what they're doing and they know how to get me to learn. So those two, I think, are very much, instrumental. They can be learnt in a way. The third is very different because, of course, it varies from person to person, from teacher to teacher, but importantly also from student to student. I mean, we all have our different personalities. Some people may be empathetic, some people less empathetic. But that doesn't mean to say that the less empathetic person might not be a very good teacher.
Right.
So that's very idiosyncratic, I think. So I was going to sort of give a list of sort of adjectives I thought made a good teacher. I thought maybe not, because when you come to the student, one student, and we hear this from colleagues at PolyU, love that teacher who, will beat them if they don't get it right, who insists on everything being correct. And no, you don't talk now, I'm talking. Just wants to do what they're told and will learn like that. The other student who's the total opposite, perhaps a design student, who just will not operate under those circumstances and needs the teacher to be a friend, needs the teacher to be somebody who will give him ideas, but not tell him what is what, and certainly not tell him what to do. There are all sorts of affective factors. I think there are also cultural expectations. And this can be important in a place like Hong Kong, where the three of us today are not native Hong Kongers. And although we think, because we've lived here a long time, we know what makes a Hong Konger tick. And so I think cultural expectations, and then the learner, as I mentioned, learners' affective factors, and also their motivation. If they're really motivated for some reason, they're probably going to want that serious teacher, the teacher who gives them most confidence about subject knowledge. And so I think for me, what makes a good teacher, as I say, it's 1 and 2. Because the affective factors you can't really change.
Right.
I'll say to Eric, you've got to smile more and make them happy. It's, those things are very difficult to change. And indeed, your students may not want you to change those. So in a way, it's the first 2. If I can skip on then to your question you gave me about whether students and teachers agree, this same research, we interviewed 37 teachers and had students and hundreds of questionnaires. We didn't get around to the teachers, so I'm just going to give you the students' view from Hong Kong and then say how I feel about it. What's interesting is that they focused, really, it was very noticeable, they focused on the pedagogical skills. Classroom management. Classroom management they saw as being really, really important. And I think this sort of fits with my idea of Hong Kongers being very pragmatic.
Right.
Yeah, this person knows what they're doing.
Right.
This person is confident.
Organized.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
So that came across very much. They didn't seem very interested at all in the idea of subject knowledge. But this might be because they assume you know your subject, particularly if you're a Guaylo teacher coming in from outside. Yeah, well, they're English, they know what they're talking about, which obviously is not always correct. But so it was definitely the pedagogical skills. The affective factors, I think, bear out what I said before. There was nothing clear. Some people said, oh, I like my teacher to be my friend. Others didn't want that. I'll just pick out one thing, though, that I really liked. And it came from 2 students, which I thought was interesting. And they used a single word. They said, I want my teacher to have heart. In other words, I want my teacher to care for me.
Right, to have passion.
Yeah, we unfortunately, because of the constraints of the project, we didn't get back to these students. But I felt it was something, when it's at the heart, it's caring, sort of looking after in some way. So whether teachers feel like that, I don't know. I suspect within a centre, from my knowledge of the colleagues I worked with, you'd get 80 different answers from 80 different people.
Right.
Likewise from students. So all you can do is accumulate the 2 and then do some sort of comparison. And whether that's very meaningful, I'm not terribly sure. Right. So I don't know whether that's answered your question.
I think so.
It definitely is, and it kind of makes us wish we had more time, because we would love to get into this a little bit deeper, because these are fascinating questions.
Yeah. But it goes to the heart of everything, really, doesn't it?
Right. And it's how everybody sees it, sees teachers differently. What Johnny sees as a good teacher is different than what Jane sees as a good teacher. Bruce, we want to end with just a fun question. Now that we've talked about all these these serious topics, something more lighthearted, I guess. If you had to create an album called 21 plus years at the ELC or 21 years at PolyU, what would be the names of the first 3 tracks?
This took me a lot longer than anything else to do because I had to get it right. Okay, I've chosen 3 and then 2 as the last track. I think the first one might be a song by Nina Simone, very famous jazz and blues singer. And the song was called Feeling Good. And it's about a new experience. And so for me, it was a new job, a new place, a whole new life. So for the first few years of PolyU and the English department, it was all new. When I first came here, I worked early on with Phil Benson on how the World Wide Web might be used in research. And people thought we were a bit crazy. But, you know, things move on. So it was all new. It was all exciting. It was all fun, I suppose. The next one is a rather more obscure track. And one of the lines in the song is "Change has come and you can't hide at the edges." And the song is called "Change Has Come." And it's from an alt rock American band called the Screaming Trees. And I think that sort of characterizes perhaps the last 10, perhaps 15 years. There's been so much change. So many things have changed so quickly within the university, within the center, certainly within Hong Kong, within pedagogy, technologically, etc. So change has come. But at the same time, my next track would be from the Velvet Underground, Beginning to See the Light. Because I think certainly in our center, we've got a group of people who, despite having all their various different views on things, particularly on things technological, I got the impression by the time I left that, yeah, even those who really didn't like what was happening sort of saw that, yeah, you know, we're getting there, we can sort of do it. And while I empathize enormously with you in the past 2 years of the teaching with COVID, I've done very little teaching, but I'm chatting to people when I go into work. Now, when you talk to them about being online, I detect almost, I suspect, a little bit of relief. Oh, yeah, we're back online. You know, I know how to do this now. It's sort of, yeah, it has its advantages. So Beginning to See the Light was the third track. As I say, I put 2 more on just as a bit of fun for the last tracks. The first of the last ones was a song by Bowie called Move On, for obvious reasons.
Yes.
Might pack a bag and move on. And the last one from the Rolling Stones, perhaps tongue-in-cheek, perhaps not, was Before They Make Me Run. So, yeah, those have been my album.
Well, those are some great lyrics, Bruce. Very metaphorical here. Okay, so yeah, as we've talked about during today's session, you have been at the ELC for quite some time. You've seen lots of changes. I like to say you left on a high note. Can you summarize your time here at PolyU in 3 words? Is it possible to get down to 3 words?
Well, you asked me for 3 tracks and I gave you 5.
Yes, I'm seeing a trend here.
You asked for 3 words, I'm going to give you 4. I think the word I'm going to use was trepidation. Because I came into the English department here. It was the first time I'd worked in an English university setting. And as I mentioned, I was sort of in at the deep end a bit at the beginning, working with Phil Benson on the World Wide Web. I hadn't really had any inkling of what it was all about. It all seemed a bit sort of I don't know, it took me a time to get my head around what it was that they were suggesting, that you might do research using a computer. It seemed a bit odd. So that was all a little bit worrying. I had a new life, living in Hong Kong, trying to find somewhere to live, a whole new environment like that. And so I think trepidation. And then setting up the sill, which was something I enjoyed enormously. But again, there's quite a lot of pressure because you have millions of dollars. There were three of us, and quite a lot rode on our shoulders. And so that was, again, trepidation. And finally, when I took over from Pam Smith as director of the Language Centre, that was definitely trepidation. It means a big centre, is 120 people, lots to look forward to, but trepidation. The second one, I was reluctant to use this word, but I think I will. Achievement. I think we have achieved a lot. And the obvious two areas are the sill, which I think at its time was, I use this expression, and then I think perhaps I shouldn't, but I think it was, and perhaps is, it was globally a cutting edge self-access center. When you read stuff, the people talking about self-access, they talked about Hong Kong. And if they talked specifically about centers, they would generally talk about UST and PolyU. So I'm very pleased with that. So I think achievement in terms of SIL, and also much more so on a bigger scale, achievement in terms of the ELC. We've moved on a huge way from being seen simply as a language clinic, a language factory. We had almost zero respect within the university at all. When I first took over, trying to get to meet other heads of department was really difficult. I encountered a lot of coldness, a lot of hostility. Wow. Now that doesn't happen anymore. The ELC has developed itself to the point where it's respected as an academic and not just a pedagogical unit. And I think that's partly due to the fact that some 10, 15 years ago, we did decide to push, and we really had to push, to develop something of a research scholarly activity portfolio. And I think that was terribly important. And so in terms of achievement, I think getting the centre to where it is now, and now Sean's taking it on even further, I think in that respect, I think achievement is my second word. However, it is PolyU, so my third word is frustration. And it's not frustration with colleagues, it's not frustration with Hong Kong. The PolyU ecosystem has the British civil service sort of thinking has a lot to answer, and it has infused the PolyU system, the management, the way the Polytechnic was run. And then at the beginning of when it started as a university, it was very keen to keep the Polytechnic ethos, which perhaps in retrospect was not the best thing to do, because what you now have is a system where you have academic growth, you have research growth, but you still have this administrative system that is based on, as I say, the sort of British civil service, and it's stymied so much. I think it's changed a lot in the last 6-8 years, but it's still there, and I think it really holds PolyU back. And on top of that, then you get the QA obsession, and PolyU takes it much further than other universities. The ex-head of the English department, Hans, came to see me a few months after he'd been here, and he said, "Bruce, I can't believe this place," because he was a Baptist before. And he said, it's just unbelievable, the systems, the bureaucracy. And as I say, I think it's changed a lot. But my third word there is frustration. And my fourth bonus is just appreciation. I've worked with a lot of people. I'm talking about the centre primarily, although there are a few outside the centre, a few people from across the university, but within the centre. And it's been generally a joy because everybody's very different, but it's amazing in a centre like ours how relatively harmonious over 27 years things have been. Normally you get little cliques, and I don't mean that of course we have groups of people who are a bit insular and get on with themselves and don't talk to anybody else, but it's not the sort of bitter vitriol you get at nearly every single other I won't say language centre necessarily, but departments across Hong Kong. I mean, you've probably heard about some of the stuff that goes on, and we haven't had that. And so I have great appreciation for our colleagues in that way as well. So there you go, 4 words: trepidation, achievement, frustration, and appreciation.
So trepidation, achievement, frustration, and appreciation. I think that's that kind of sums up a lot of our experiences.
When you notice that they're parallel, they're all nouns.
And famous last words.
quite poetic. Yeah, I could. It does encapsulate the full spectrum though of emotions. Anytime you're working anywhere, or
I guess so. Yeah.
You got a mix of positives and negatives, and that kind of described those 3 title tracks as well. Change has come, change is coming, but we embrace it anyways. And I think if that's anything that our listeners can take away from that, is it's a fast changing world, it's a fast changing city, it's a fast changing profession, but ultimately, a lot of these changes do lead to something better, and maybe that's what we can take away from your from your discussion. And we would love to discuss longer. I know Dawn would. We have some more questions we'd like to ask, but
another time.
We'll have to save that for our next one. Bruce, thank you so much again for.
You're welcome. Thank
you.
And we really appreciate it. And thank you, everybody, coming at you from PolyU, the Teacher's Lift. Thank you very much.